1973, Brian, Clarence's brother Russell, and Alan Woodhouse, all members of the Pinaymootang First Nation on the Fairford Indian Reserve, were living in Winnipeg, and Saulteaux Ojibwe was their first language. None of them had criminal records. They were all gainfully employed. Brian was 18. Alan Woodhouse was 17. He was not even an adult. Clarence Woodhouse was 21, and Russell, his brother, was 18. On July 22nd of 1973, the four men, if I call them that, the four young men, the four youths, were charged in the brutal murder of a man called Ting Fong Chan. He'd been murdered 5 days earlier by an unknown assailant or assailants on the streets of Winnipeg as he walked home from work. He worked as a cook in a Chinese restaurant in Winnipeg. Neither Clarence, nor Brian, nor Russell, nor AJ were there when he was killed. Had absolutely nothing to do with this homicide. The four of them were all asleep in their beds at the time. Nevertheless, police heard that the crime had been committed by four Indigenous men. Just heard it and knew that these four men lived in the area, so they went and arrested them. And then they assaulted all four of them and made them sign false confessions. From the beginning, they proclaimed their innocence in the courts, but no one believed. In the case of Clarence and Russell, they didn't even speak English such that they could give the fluent confessions that they were alleged to have given and then signed. Despite all this, they went to trial for murder before an all-white male jury. Police officers, of course, were all white. The lawyers were all white, and the judge, of course, was white. And the prosecution's case was entirely dependent on their confessions. There wasn't an iota of eyewitness evidence, circumstantial evidence, or forensic evidence that linked them to the crime. And all four men testified that they did not commit the crime, and their confessions were false. The trial was prosecuted by George Dangerfield, a well-known cause of wrongful convictions. Clarence, for example, gave his evidence before the court, and he needed a Saulteaux interpreter in order to be able to give it. You might have thought that was a bit of a hint that he couldn't have given a confession in fluent English that he then signed. And he said, he was asked, "Did you tell them anything?" "No." "Do you know how all this writing got down here?" "No." "You didn't tell them anything at all?" "No," said Clarence. And so did the others. But the judge told the jury that, and I quote, "If all this beating was going on that night, and I can group together the evidence of all four of the accused men, then there must have been a conspiracy by a goodly portion of the Winnipeg police force on duty that particular time. We have no less than 3 teams of detectives, no less than 2 duty sergeants, and there were others. I needn't run through them all, but we have something pushing 10 people, all of whom must have been involved or at least aware of the fact that something very, very improper was going on in the public safety building that night. Now, members of the jury, you can believe that if you want to. It's your privilege to believe it. This, of course, is an indictment of the police force. It practically amounts to accusing the police of a conspiracy. For these things to have happened, we'd have to have Detectives King, Murdoch, Very, and Scott involved. We have the other 2 detectives, Wallace and Jansen. We have Sergeant Stephen. Not surprisingly, the jury convicted. And the judge then, in sentencing the 4 men, had this to say. And this is the judge of what was then the Manitoba Queen's Bench, the highest trial court, still is the highest trial court in the province. This is part of what the judge said to the 4 men. "This is not a jungle where we live. It is not a wild land. We are not subduing this land from anybody. We are not still taking it from wild people." Extraordinary series of statements that tell you so much about the criminal justice system as it existed, at least in 1974, when those words were spoken. We appeared before the Chief Justice of what by now was the King's Bench of Manitoba, Chief Justice Joyal, who may be a familiar name to many of you. And the Crown acknowledged, to their credit, that they've been convicted as a result of racism from beginning to end, from the moment of their arrest to the moment of their sentencing, and even through the appeal period thereafter. And Chief Justice Joyal said some words that really needed to be said. And this is what he said back in July of 2023. He said, "A Chief Justice in any court in this country, indeed any court anywhere, if they have an ounce of fairness and justice in them, would admit to being ill-equipped to find adequate words that could possibly speak to what you men must have endured." So I'm going to speak to you now in very plain language that I think can and hopefully will communicate a very heartfelt message. Understand that I speak publicly on a regular basis as a Chief Justice about the very positive features that a Canadian court and the judiciary in Canada possesses. I speak on behalf of the justice system, sometimes specifically the criminal justice system. And I regularly speak about how well we compare with other countries. But the grim and sad reality is that it's not a perfect system. And regrettably, when it fails, it can fail horribly. Yours is just such a case. The situation before me represents not just a miscarriage of justice. It represents a case where the three men convicted were in fact innocent of the crime alleged. While no one wants to be glib and self-satisfied, when we do encounter an injustice like this, it's nonetheless reasonable to say we must try to learn from it. Part of that involves trying to put in place new safeguards, new guardrails, and new protections that will avoid the next Mr. Woodhouse or the next Mr. Anderson. Clearly nothing I can say will restore all of those things that were taken from you men. I hope some of the words I've tried to communicate to you in as heartfelt and clear a way as possible will at least allow you to walk out of here hearing words from a system that hopefully can allow you to have some renewed faith in it, that while imperfect, continues to try to do better while recognizing the mistakes that may still occur.